Hey, this is former Blue Devil O-lineman Matt Skura. You're listening to Basketball Conference, the ACC football podcast. Go Duke, go ACC.
All right, welcome back in Basketball Conference, the ACC football podcast. Afternoon of July 31st, 2024. Season previews roll on. It's time to talk about the 2024 Virginia Tech Hokies. David Cunningham, we can call you a friend of the podcast now. You've been on here enough. Managing editor, techsideline.com. David, what's going on, buddy?
I'm good, man. Hope you're doing well. It's football season is here. Virginia Tech football fall camp started today, Wednesday, July 31st. So first media availability is Friday. We are officially in football season, especially after ACC Media Days last week. So I hope you're doing well. And as always, appreciate you having me on. It's always fun to chat with you.
Yeah, appreciate you jumping on. I've done a few of these previews already, and we largely interview beat writers, right? And a lot of the people who we've talked to, they're all in fall camp mode. So summer's over for the beat writers for sure. For people like me, I kind of record these wherever I'm at in a given week. But for the beat writers, it's kind of all systems go across the ACC. Virginia Tech's an interesting team, right? This team last year somehow found a way to finish 7-6 and tied for fourth in the ACC, went 5-3 in conference play. It was just like a very weird year how they got there. We had you on in the preseason. We talked about the non-conference schedule and what that had to look like. And I don't think either one of us thought Virginia Tech was going to go 5-3 in conference play, and that's how they were going to get to a bowl game. But lo and behold, that's what happened. The non-con went really poor. And then Tech kind of flipped a switch when Kyron Drones took over at quarterback. Took a couple weeks for him to get some snaps under his belt and get comfortable, but it felt like the offense just kind of hit a switch before that Pittsburgh game. And for the rest of the year, at least against the teams where Virginia Tech was playing, like on paper looked like a 50-50 game or a game that even Virginia Tech should win, Virginia Tech won those games by and large for the rest of the year. So that they found an identity offensively, and I think that's the biggest takeaway from 2023.
Yeah, I agree. It took Tech a couple weeks to get going. And if you remember, one of the big discussions we had at the beginning of fall camp last year was who's the starting quarterback.
Yeah.
Grant Wells and Kyron Drones were in this battle. And to be fair, that first week against Old Dominion, Grant Wells looked pretty good. And then Tech couldn't run the ball in the second week of the season against Purdue. And then Wells gets hurt, and it just so happens that Grant Wells getting hurt, bummer for him, but
right.
It kind of forced Tech to evolve. And it wasn't instant. Tech lost to Rutgers. Then Tech lost to Marshall. And then all of a sudden, Tech comes out, plays Pitt, kind of in a do-or-die situation at 1-3, where – people were calling for the coordinators' heads. I mean, people were saying Tyler Bowen was on the hot seat. And I think a lot of people were looking around the room going, what in the world is going on? And then Tech comes out, beats Pitt, eventually gets back to 500. There are a couple stumbles along the way, Florida State, NC State, Louisville. But and then you get to the end of the season, Tech plays a Tulane team that had lost a lot in the Military Bowl, interim head coach in Tulane, good team that was not the same team as it was in the regular season, and Tech walloped them. And now you bring everybody back, and you have that offensive identity, which I think, yes, I agree with you, was the biggest takeaway from last year. You bring everybody back from the offensive side of the ball, basically everybody, every single starter except for tight end, and you get a guy back in Nick Gallo who would have started for you last year had he not been injured. Daquan Wright was the lone offensive player, the starter to really leave, and he's at Ole Miss now. This is also a defense that returned everybody. And then you fill those gaps in the portal. You're doing pretty well on the recruiting trail. Could be better, but the Hokies are doing pretty well. You're in a good spot. And I think for Virginia Tech fans, it kind of just slowly crept up, and once we got to December and January, Hokies are hitting the portal, adding guys, and they got their number one guy in Sam Blumfield, the Mike linebacker, which I think is going to be a real boost. They added a lot in the portal defensively, but I think they're in a good spot, and because of all of the hype, because of that build up, where I mean they went from 1-3 to 7-6.
Yeah.
Like that's not something that is easily accomplished. And won 5 of its last 7 games. And now Virginia Tech is sitting here going, okay, we brought everybody back. We ended the season on a high note. We're doing well on the recruiting trail. Everybody on our staff is still here. You keep the train rolling. Of course, that momentum is naturally going to be there. So it's a very, very interesting time. Chris Coleman, my colleague at Tech Sideline, dropped an article this afternoon, which I encourage everybody to go read. He wrote about the opportunity that this team has, and an opportunity to advance the program doesn't come along very often. It was kind of there in the 90s, the late 90s. It was there in 2005 when Tech had a super talented team and finished 11-2, had national championship aspirations. It was kind of there in 2016, Fuente's first year, when Tech was a touchdown away from beating Clemson in the ACC title game, right? There were a couple moments over the last 15, 20 years that the Hokies have had opportunities to advance the program. Sometimes it's worked, sometimes it hasn't. Sometimes they've accomplished that goal, and other times it's kind of fallen by the wayside. But this is a really unique opportunity for Virginia Tech, in my opinion, because with conference realignment, with guys leaving, with the portal, you don't know what's going to happen. Fans should view rosters as kind of a one-time deal. Like, this is the 2024 roster, and it's not ever going to be the same again. You got to take advantage of it when you can.
Yeah, I'm workshopping a take, and we'll see how it goes. I view this as one of the most important seasons in like the last 30 years for Virginia Tech athletics, because not just for football, for athletics, because football has become such a big part of the college athletics landscape. And I feel like football obviously is the driving force behind all this conference realignment. And Virginia Tech doesn't really know where their home is going to be like in 5 years. Nobody has any idea, right? This stuff seems to be changing by the day. But it does seem like the ACC is on like tenuous ground. Like it's a little shaky, right? And schools are trying to escape, and where Virginia Tech's going to be 5 years from now is anybody's guess. But I'll tell you what, things become a lot easier for football programs across the country when they're good, and Virginia Tech has a chance here, right? If they go out and have a 9-10 win season, and I would call it reestablish the brand a little bit, because the school, like, for the better part of the last 15 years, has only had like a couple of really, really good seasons where it's been like, oh yeah, this is what it was like in the Beamer years all the time. Like, they haven't had a ton of those. I mean, I think back to when I first got into campus in 2011, Virginia Tech, of course, went to the Sugar Bowl. That was the Danny Cole caught it game, right? And then it took 5 years for Virginia Tech to really reposition themselves, right, as one of these schools in the ACC. Justin Fuente's first year was really, really good. Took the eventual national champions to the brink of the ACC title game. And it just wasn't really sustained throughout that Fuente era. And now Brent Pry's in year 3 of a rebuild. And, Virginia Tech was once like a really, really strong, like, national college football brand. And now it's like, oh yeah, remember those days? That's kind of like the national narrative, right? It's like, hey, remember when Virginia Tech was really, really good? And I think now is as good of a time as ever to, pop up and win 8, 9, 10 games. Obviously, the more you win, I think the better position you're in on a national scale. Maybe other conferences, if it's not going to be a future home in the ACC, looks at you and says, you know what, this is like a viable brand that we should really look at. And the reason why I bring all that up, David, is because the player retention, I think, was a really big deal. The fact that they were able to bring back legitimately like all of their difference makers in the receiving core. The fact that they were able to keep Kyron Drones after a breakout year. Bashal Tootin returned. The offensive line struggled, but all those guys are back from a continuity standpoint. That's really important. The defense loses Nasir Peoples to graduation. Derek Canteen goes into a transfer portal, not because of an NIL situation, but because he just wanted a different role, and Virginia Tech knew they weren't going to be able to provide it. Canteen speaks glowingly about Brett Pry and the program. It was a very cordial exit for Canteen after like one pretty productive year as kind of that nickelback role, right, for Virginia Tech. I feel like the Hokies are in a pretty decent spot NIL-wise, and it seems like it's improving. And the proof's in the pudding, so to speak, right, in terms of who they were able to retain, because I feel like it's a difficult task to bring as many underclassmen back, right, as they did. All these guys who had a really productive year on an ascending team last year, to be able to bring like most of those guys back, I feel like is so significant.
Yeah, winning, sure, of course, makes everything easier. The way Virginia Tech ended the 2023 season set the trajectory, in my opinion, for this offseason and this upcoming season. If Tech does not win 5 of its last 7 games, I'm not sure that you get a lot of these guys coming back. And you would get some, but not everybody.
Right.
And by everybody, it's you've got your 4 core wide receivers back. Bashal Tootin and Kyron Jones, as you mentioned. Everybody on offense. I mean, I did the math the other day. Looking at starters from last year, it's about 18 of 22 starters on offense and defense. And you've got your punter and your kicker.
Yeah. Special teams, yeah, huge.
Like that stuff matters. And I'm very, very curious to see what the vibe is when we get to talk to these guys at fall camp. Obviously, we talked to Pry and a couple players at the ACC kickoff last week in Charlotte, conference media days. Very interested to see what the vibe is in camp, because they weren't shying away from expectations. But when you bring as many guys back on both sides of the ball as you do, there are going to be expectations.
Right.
When you add the way you do, there are going to be expectations. I mean, Dorian Strong and Antoine Powell-Ryland are both back, as is Mansour Delane. I mean, there are only a few spots, I think, that Tech has kind of question marks or issues. And I'm sure we'll get to those later. But Tech has positioned itself very well for success this year. And in the bigger picture, what you mentioned it, Mike, what does a winning football season do for the Virginia Tech brand?
Yeah.
In this era of conference realignment, you have to put yourself first. And if Virginia Tech is winning games, people know the Virginia Tech brand. And the biggest thing is, I think there are opportunities this year for the Hokies to capitalize on that brand.
Yep.
The first one that comes to my mind is week 5. They've got Miami on a Friday night, and that's ACC opener. Miami's going to be picked pretty highly. Tech, I think, also is going to be picked pretty highly. That is a potential, where you got 2 4-0 teams. I'm not sure if Miami will hold up that end of the bargain. Tech could also stumble the week prior against Rutgers, but there are opportunities for the Hokies to do really, really big things. It's not like they will not have a stage. It's not like they will not have anybody watching them, right? People understand. I think a little bit of a tangent, but I think like the new college football video game coming out, kind of, it's something that we had in obviously up to 2014. I think it kind of helps everybody see what teams around the country are like actually pretty good and which ones aren't, and what teams are fun to play with. And I don't know how much that factors into your older fans, but certainly the younger audience. There are people there. Think about this, Mike. There are people who are in college right now that didn't really grow up with a good Virginia Tech football team.
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, I think about the students who, like, there are some kids getting there that were born in 2006.
Yeah.
And their first Virginia Tech memories, I mean, they would probably have been 5 in 2011, right? And
makes me feel old.
Yeah, well,
it's true.
Yes,
though.
It makes me feel old as well. But I'm just thinking there are so many people that the people who are around for that entire era obviously know what Virginia Tech can be, but there are so many people who don't. And I think this is an opportunity to kind of, like you said, reestablish the brand. And if Virginia Tech can do that successfully, win 8, 9, 10 games, play big teams close, potentially compete for an ACC championship, which a handful of the guys in Charlotte said is the goal, to get to Charlotte in December. And I think it's a realistic goal.
I think so too.
You're looking at a team that has a lot of talent, good culture, kind of doing everything right behind the scenes. And if you can kind of Tech can kind of put itself in the spotlight, it's going to be a brand that if realignment comes around, it is going to be on the favorable side instead of, if you win 6 or 7 games and drop a bunch and the fans aren't happy and who knows what's coming around the corner in 2025, if realignment happens, it might be a little shakier. So there's a lot in the bigger picture riding on this season than just football, which is not something that comes up every single year.
I agree. Yeah, that's where I'm at. It's the impact to the brand is, I feel like, a really important thing that I don't feel like is being talked about enough right now. Like, a lot of Virginia Tech fans are saying, "Oh, Virginia Tech can go here, or they can go here, or they can go there." And it's like, yeah, but somebody's got to want them. Like, somebody's gonna want that brand. Like, we're getting further and further away from the years where Virginia Tech was dominant in football, and to say that doesn't matter because they had a great run under Frank Beamer. The best years of Beamer going on like to almost 20 years ago. I mean, it's getting to that point. Like, Tech was dominant in the mid 2000s, right? Like, it's 2024. It's been 13 years, and Virginia Tech's been really, really competitive on a national level twice in 13 years. This is a really, really important season from that standpoint. So it's just something I'm thinking about going into it. I think it needs to be talked about a little bit more than it is. I think people like to talk about next destination and not as much about what it's going to take to get there. I feel like this year and having a good product on the field might not be like the most important thing, but I do think it is important that Virginia Tech goes out and has the year that a lot of people are expecting them to have. We talked about quarterback with Kyron Drones. Obviously, he's really dynamic and head the snake and all that, and they center the entire offense around he and Bayshell Tootin with how good he was at running back last year. The question I have going into the year, I think naturally, is about the offensive line. Obviously, bringing back a lot of continuity there. Last year, I think things got better throughout the year, but the one thing I will say too is like, and I think this is a benefit obviously to the offensive line as far as outlook going into this season, is the fact that I think the way that Virginia Tech is running their offense right now and how it's tailored around the running ability of Drones, his ability to create outside the pocket as a passer, and then what he's able to do in the quarterback run game, I do think it helps the offensive line a good bit. Virginia Tech's been sliding the pocket on pass plays and things like that, a lot of quarterback rollouts and stuff like that. It's easier to block that way. That definitely helped the offensive line the back half of last year. I think that'll continue this year. How good does Virginia Tech's offensive line have to be, do you think, for the Hokies to reach like their ceiling? Do they have to be excellent, or do you think this offense and the way that they scheme things up, do you think it really matters if they're like just average or maybe slightly above average versus like freaking outstanding? Because I'm not sure they have to be necessarily outstanding, right? Because I don't think they're going to be. I just don't think they have the personnel to be. But I think they can be good enough for Virginia Tech's offense to be really, really productive once again.
That is my number one question heading into this season. There are some questions on the defensive side of the ball that I have, but if this offense was good once it found its rhythm last year, I think Tyler Bowen did a fantastic job week 5 and beyond of tailoring everything the Hokies did to Kyron Drones' strengths. Yeah. And once they got on a roll, they were really, really good. However, there were a couple games where they got pushed around. You've got Miami, you've got Rutgers, you've got Clemson on the schedule. Those are the 3 games that jump out to me as teams that will have really good lines.
Fronts, yep.
That you will have to be good against in the trenches. I think they will have to be able to hold their own in those games and give a little push. They won't be able to just sit back there and take it. They
Right.
will have to be able to establish the run against a team like Miami and a team like Clemson if they want to win those games. And
it was the biggest differentiator in the big games that they lost last year. It was so clear that they were just at a disadvantage up front against Miami, against Louisville, against Florida State, and then against NC State to a degree, especially in the second half. Those 3 games in particular, I was like, man, they've just seemed overmatched up front.
You go and look at the Louisville game.
Yeah.
Virginia Tech had I'm looking at it right now. Virginia Tech had 68 yards on the ground.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, this is a team that was phenomenal in that area
Running all over everybody.
Against basically everybody else.
Yeah.
28 carries for 68 yards. Tech gained 120 yards, but also lost 52. A handful of those was because of 4 sacks. But
right.
Still, this was a team that struggled in that area. And that's what I'm talking about when I say taking the next step. You have to be competitive in those games, and it starts up front. If the Hokies cannot get a push against Miami or a push against Rutgers, and I think Rutgers is going to be the first big test. Week 4,
flying under the
Lane
radar
Stadium. They've got Common on guy, both sides of the ball. You have to be able to stop the run and run the ball. That's the number one differentiator in college football. And if the Hokies prove they can do that, it's going to be a big difference. To answer your question, I think they have to be – I'm not worried about Virginia Tech playing against the offensive line when Virginia Tech plays against teams like Syracuse and Georgia Tech. I think they will those – that group will be good enough in those games. We saw that last year. You get everybody back. I expect that group to at least be what it was last year. And if that group did what it did last year in those games, the Hokies are winning those games. But if you want to take that next step, the offensive line has to be that much better for the Hokies. I don't think they have to be excellent, but I think that unit needs to be on a scale of 10. I think that unit needs to be around an 8 when you play those big games. Not perfect, obviously. It's hard to be perfect, but at least 7 or 8 to give yourself a good chance. And in those games, Mike, I think it's more about complementary football than anything. Like, you have to give yourself a chance in all phases of the game.
Agree. Yeah, agree. Yep.
But the problem is when the Hokies played in some of those games last year, they were getting gashed on both sides. So the offensive line, I think the way the Hokies schemed everything up, I mean, one of the things I am most curious to talk with Kyron Drones about, and Chris Coleman spoke with him at ACC Media Days about this, and I'm interested to hear more about it when I talk to more players on the offense.
Yep.
What is the difference coming into this offseason in terms of Kyron Drones is the starter? Because I think that made a difference last year, even if guys won't necessarily say, oh, it was huge. I think it at least factors in a little bit when you've got quarterbacks splitting the reps every single practice.
Yeah, continuity.
Kyron Jones is going to get the number 1 reps this year. It's not even close. And if this offensive line can continue to improve, and I think, Mike, the biggest thing is I think the Hokies have more depth up there. I'm not saying they are the best offensive line in the conference by any stretch, but I think Brent Pry told us he feels comfortable with about 8 guys now. I think last year you're probably sitting there thinking about 4 or 5 were pretty good.
Yeah, and the year before that you were like, can 2 of these guys be good?
Yeah, so if you can build that depth, I think Ron Crook showed that he could help scheme stuff up the right way. If you can take that next step where you are competitive in every single game, especially against the big boys, you'll be in a good spot.
I think the biggest sign of a healthy program, obviously, is the ability to build out depth. It's one of the first signs of a rebuild that's going in a good direction. Is not only are you retaining top-tier talent with your starters, but you're starting to build out that depth. I think what you just spoke to with the offensive line in particular is really key because, like we both just mentioned, for year 1 it was like, can anyone play, right? And then year 2 it was like, all right, well, feel good about 4 of these guys, now it's like, okay, I feel good about 7 or 8 of these guys. I mean, that's gigantic when you go through a year, especially when we look at the schedule later on and you see Clemson in November. It's like, all right, Clemson's going to have a good front, so you better be able to block them late in the season. And I think having 7 or 8 guys you can rely upon that you think can give you good snaps is obviously key. The one thing I want to add on to and ask you about next, and you brought it up a little bit in your last answer, was the complementary football piece. I thought when Virginia Tech was at its best last year, obviously it was playing good complementary football. The issue earlier in the year was they couldn't run the ball, and then they couldn't stop anybody, right? And it was like right up the middle of the defense. I feel like Virginia Tech has done their best to remediate that issue, right? I mean, you mentioned Brumfield. They bring in Aeneas Peebles. He's an all-ACC defensive tackle from Duke last year. This is the unit where I feel like they tried to fortify the middle of the defense as much as they could. Kelvin Gilliam, a guy that they were in on the recruiting trail, a former 4-star recruit, he's in to add, more depth up front. It just feels like they're in a better place in terms of guys who know their role. Whereas I think the first couple of years, Pry and his staff, defensively especially, they were like, look, we want guys to be versatile and be able to play multiple positions, but we also want to just figure out the right fit for some of these existing guys on the roster. And now I just feel like they're starting to get into a position where they know where the guys fit on the defense, and that's just another really healthy sign that things are moving in a good direction when the players just simply know their roles.
Yeah, I think that's important. I mean, the Hokies, one of you could say one of the biggest gripes that I think people have had with Pry and the staff over the last couple of years has been so many guys have been practicing so many different linebacker positions.
Yeah.
It's like how in the world is a guy going to spend, a couple of weeks playing Mike and then a couple of weeks playing Will, and then you're going to move him over to Star, and they're trying to they don't really have a chance to wrap their head around everything.
Right.
I think it's big for them to have a lot of continuity across the board. I think Brumfield provides that. You get a healthy Kelly Lawson. I think he will provide that at will. Keontae Jenkins, not talked about enough. He is consistent at Star. And then you fill in the gaps behind him. And you hope that should be a good enough 3. But I think Tech also feels comfortable with the guys who are coming in behind them now. And that's important. I think from across the board, but I look at the corner and safety spots. Like now Tech has the opportunity, because I think some young cornerbacks have developed so well. Tech has a little bit of the opportunity to play Dorian Strong and Mansour Delane, who are 2 of the best cornerbacks in the ACC, in some different roles. They can play him at nickel. They can play him at safety. They can use different looks if needed. And I think that bringing back everybody certainly helps. When you have everybody back that you are familiar with, it gives you such a leg up. You're not searching and trying to figure out what works best with who and what not. You just kind of have to plug and fill and roll with it. Can Tech take advantage of it? That's my biggest question. You essentially are going to have, Tech reloaded up front, obviously, which you mentioned. There are a lot of talented players. Still interested to see how some of the new guys mesh and fit, but we also saw a little bit of that in the spring game.
Yeah,
and Kamari Copeland had a pick in the spring game. He's a JUCO guy, highly touted. I expect a guy like that to have an immediate impact. Same with Aeneas Peebles. And if there's no drop off, that gives you a leg up, because you are already starting from a bigger, or you're jumping off from a better point already, because you don't have to kind of reinvent yourself all over the field. You've got a better starting block, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, you lose Kendricks and Pollard, then you add Gilliam, Fuga stays, you add Gilliam, you add Peebles, you add Copeland. I mean, that's just gigantic that you're able to supplement with guys that, if they weren't proven commodities already at the FBS level, or they've at least, been. I'm thinking more in like Gilliam's case. He's played like enough snaps, and he's in a position where, like, obviously he wasn't in a starting role at Oklahoma, but he was a highly enough touted recruit. He's got multiple years of eligibility left, so you bring him in and hope that you can kind of get him to play to the level that he was as a recruit. I just think Tech supplemented in the right places defensively, and I think the one thing you alluded to that I think is really important is the fact that, like, they brought in guys to fit particular roles. It wasn't just like, and I understand why Pry and his staff kind of did this, but it wasn't just like drinking from a fire hose. Let's bring in like anybody who's willing to come that can play out of the portal, like the first couple of years, right? And then just let's get a bunch of good football players and figure it out later. which I understand that strategy when you're starting literally from scratch when you first get here because of who Tech lost to graduation, the transfer portal after Fuente left. But this is a situation now where it's like, well, Tech can be strategic, right? Not only were they able to add in the portal, but they were able to keep the guys that were productive last year and just fill in the gaps as they go. And I just think that's really, really important. Virginia Tech's secondary, I mean, safety is the area where I've had questions the last couple of years. It does certainly help when you know that you're going to have two of the best cornerbacks in the conference in Dorian Strong and Mansour Delane. I mean, that kind of helps figure out everything else. And when Virginia Tech, I think, looks like on paper, at least, they're going to be stronger in the middle of the defense up front, both at linebacker and on the interior portions of the defensive line, it makes you a little less worried about safeties having to make all the tackles like they did at parts of last year. Like, your safety shouldn't be as involved as it was in run support for at least the month of September last year. So I think for all the questions that I still have about safety and, whether or not Jalen Stroman's going to be healthy, whether or not, the hype around Jalen Jones and his development, whether or not that's warranted, I do feel like Tech fans can go into the year knowing, okay, like, these are two of the best cornerbacks in the conference. If they stay healthy and the middle of the defense looks a lot better and plays to its capability relative to a year ago, this is a defense that should be really, really strong, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Strong and Delane are fantastic, and we've seen that time and time again. I mean, Tech getting Dorian Strong back is huge.
Yeah,
I think he's one of the most underrated players in the conference. He was barely a third-team All-ACC pick last year.
Yep.
And he led the country in, according to PFF, in basically quarterback rating of any corner who had over 100 targets. He only allowed like 7 completions. And you pair him with Delane, who's been really, really good. My question is safety as well. Now, one of the things I'm most interested to see is, can the linebackers play to the level they are capable of? If they can, everything else, I think, you just turn to the safeties, and it's on the safeties then. That would be if the linebackers are good, it comes down to the safeties, because I expect the defensive line to be good. I think Tech's defensive end room is fantastic.
Yeah,
I think defensive tackle, obviously a lot of guys who have not played at Tech before, but a lot of talent. And J.C. Price has done really good things up front. I mean, think about this, Mike. Last year, the Hokies were not a good team. In 2022, they were not a good team up front. They barely got to the quarterback at all. So much talk going into last year was about getting to the quarterback, winning one-on-one battles. Antoine Power-Island comes in as 9.5 sacks.
Yeah, that helped.
Tech was 10th in the country in sacks last year after being like near the bottom the previous season. The staff, that is just one area where the staff has plugged the right guys in. Hopefully that change, Tech is hoping that change comes at linebacker where it continues to improve, and you get Lawson, Brumfield, Jenkins together. That's a pretty good trio. You got other guys behind them. I worry about safety because Tech had 2 guys in Nasir Peoples and Jalen Stroman last year. Stroman is back. Peoples is gone. I don't believe they played an entire game together until maybe the last game of the season.
Yep.
Peoples was hurt for a good chunk of the year. Stroman had multiple targeting penalties.
Yeah.
And then Stroman was injured.
Then he was
and
injured.
Peoples had a targeting penalty or 2. Those guys could not stay on the field at the same time. As a result, you're relying on guys in Jalen Jones. You're relying on a true freshman in Mose Phillips. And Jalen Jones, it was his first year playing safety.
Yeah.
I wonder. One of my questions for Brent Pry is going to be: Can any of these freshmen, in my mind specifically Quentin Reddish, does Quentin Reddish have a chance to help in some moments? I think the safety depth
looks like physically he could play now, right?
Yeah. Is he ready though? We saw how bad Mose Phillips got gashed at times last year. I think the defense, it will come down to how good Tech's safeties are. Can Jalen Stroman stay on the field? And I don't just mean injury. I don't just mean targeting. It's a combination of everything.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Jalen Jones. What is his next progression forward? I think that's an okay trio. I think Stroman is really, really good. In some cases, Stroman is the most important player for Tech on the field at moments defensively, because if he's not on the field, Peoples was hurt for a good chunk of last year. It was the Jones and Peoples show.
Yeah.
And Jones and Phillips show.
Phillips, yeah. Yep.
And the linebackers are not very good, but the safeties struggled too. And it has to be a group effort stopping the run. And to me, again, I bring up that Rutgers game. I don't know how much you'll find out about Tech safeties in those first couple games. But then again, I know Rasheen Ali's gone at Marshall, so that makes that game.
That helps.
Helps. Tech safeties got gashed in that game last year.
Yeah.
Rutgers is going to be a huge test. There were times last year in that game where I vividly remember those two guys, Jones and Phillips, just making the wrong read, being in the wrong gap. You have to be able to at least be in the right place.
Yeah.
To give yourself an opportunity. And if Tech can do that, do the bare minimum there with those guys. I expect those guys to improve. That is my number one question defensively. So you got the offensive line biggest question offensively, the safeties defensively. Otherwise, you're looking at a group on both sides of the ball that's really, really strong.
Yeah.
But I think there are a couple moments, a couple positions, areas, whatever you want to call it, on offense and defense that if Virginia Tech doesn't get at least average play, Tech has the chance to be not a world of hurt, but it kind of lowers the ceiling a little bit.
Let's take a quick second to remind you about Section103.com. It is the internet's premier place for all things wonderful Georgia Tech apparel. They've got t-shirts, they've got sweatshirts, they've got hoodies, they've got a short sleeve coach hoodie if you want to look like Coach Key. They've got onesies for babies. They've got all things for any man, woman, children, something for the whole family, all the Georgia Tech fans in your life. They need something from Section103.com. Use promo code GOACC for 10% off your first order. You can go get t-shirts supporting NIL efforts with guys like Haynes King and Zach Pyron. They've got shirts supporting the basketball team, the baseball team, the volleyball team, all sorts of wonderful Tech traditions, all sorts of things. Again, any Georgia Tech fan in your life, they need something from Section103.com. Once again, use promo code GOACC for 10% off your first order. I particularly love the Feliz Bobby Dodd sweatshirts. We got Christmas season coming up before you know it. You're going to want one of those for your holiday party. Go get it all at Section103.com. Huge shout out to Steven and the gang. Thank you so much to them for their support of the Basketball Conference podcast. We would love it if you guys would go show your support for Section103.com as well. Now, back to the episode.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the thing about Mose Phillips playing a decent amount of snaps last year is that, and in particular playing with Jalen Jones a lot, is that I know Jalen Jones is a senior, but like I treated last year almost as if it was like a freshman year just because it was a brand new position. And so the way I looked at it was like you're almost like playing two freshmen. It's like two first-year players back there in the secondary at times. And was it always pretty? No. Do I think it's going to serve them now going into this year and put them in a better spot? Yeah, I do. Like, I think this is going to be, from a depth standpoint, you have guys who have played that you can rely upon. The lights aren't going to be too bright. They're not going to be looking bug-eyed when they first, when they first take the field. They've been out there before. I think that helps. The offensive line and the safeties, those are my two concerns as well. I think the defensive line and the linebacking core, I think will be pretty good. I think the linebacking core will be much improved. You got a lot of different guys you can throw at the problem. Now you have a true Mike linebacker. Defensive line, I think they'll get after a quarterback. I think they're fortified on the interior. I just think it's going to be a better looking unit. It looks better on paper. I think if there are some injuries, they got guys to throw at the issue. This is the best spot I think the front seven has been in certainly since Brent Pry's been here by far. And then you have two of the best corners, not only in the ACC, but I mean they're two of the top 10 corners in the country in Strong and Delane, and I think that's gigantic. Looking at the schedule, and this is one of those podcasts, David, where like I think people who aren't Virginia Tech fans, right, they've gone into this kind of understanding like Virginia Tech's been getting a pretty decent amount of hype, right? We know what they're bringing back at quarterback and running back with Tootin, and the receiving core is going to be really, really good and deep, and they got a lot of guys there. But I think a lot of people are really interested in where Virginia Tech's going to end up. And before we even talk about like the particular games on the schedule, just from a high level view in comparison to 2023, do you think this team is going to be, assuming they finish with more than 7 wins, do you think this team is going to make a jump more because of what they're bringing back or because of their softer schedule, or do you think it's probably just going to be a little bit of both?
Probably a little bit of both. I would lean probably more towards what Tech brings back. I would say roster construction is probably the biggest reason why. But then again, if Virginia Tech had Georgia Tech's schedule,
yeah,
it would be
prism I'm viewing it. Yeah, that's the prism I'm viewing it through.
It would be really, really different.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a combination of both. And the funny thing is, I look back at last year's schedule and go, man, I mean, can you imagine if Virginia Tech had taken care of business in the non-conference?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
Tech, and if Tech could go back and play those games again, Tech's starting out 3-1. Tech's not losing to Purdue in a game that featured a 6.5-hour rain delay, the longest in college football history, and Tech's not losing on the road at Marshall. But there were too many times last year where Tech, I think, was indecisive early. I think Brent Pry enters year 3 with a coaching staff. Like, I think it's a mix of everything, Mike. You've got all your coaches back, almost all your players back. You're plugging guys in the right holes, and then you've got a schedule that sets up pretty well.
Yeah.
If you look at where Tech is favored in these games, the only 2 games Virginia Tech will walk into that it is not favored in, Miami and Clemson. And that says a lot.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean Tech's going to win them all. However, I think the Hokies have put themselves in a good position and at the same time have been awarded a good schedule.
Yeah.
Like, that's just kind of the way it shakes out. You have to capitalize now when you have the chance. That's what we talked about earlier. This is a big moment. I think everything is kind of setting up for them to have a good year. But then again, and there have been a couple people, my boss Will Stewart at Tech Sideline, he wrote about it last year, I believe, after the Boston College game. David Teal, the Richmond Times-Dispatch, wrote a similar column from Charlotte last week. There's a checklist, and the Hokies have checked a couple boxes. There are other boxes to check, and one of them is beat a good team, period. The Hokies beat everybody last year that they should have beaten after the first 4 games of the year.
Right.
They beat teams they should beat at home and on the road. The next step is beating a good team both at home and on the road. And they will have the opportunity to do that this year. They will have Rutgers and Miami in back-to-back weeks. They will have Clemson. There are going to be games where they will have the chance to continue to raise their stock. I think, again, man, this sets up really, really well, in my opinion, in so many different areas. It's now, can Virginia Tech go win games? You got to go do it on the football field.
Agree with everything. Legitimately, just agree with everything you just said. And I'm looking at the schedule now too, and it's like, do I think the schedule obviously benefits Virginia Tech? Yes. I mean, let's not breaking any new ground here. David and I are both alums of Virginia Tech. We would love to see the program do well, right? Taking the David's reporter hat off for a minute and taking my podcasting hat off and the bias. the non-bias, right, of it. We would love to see the school that we went to do well in football. I look at the schedule, and this is just a non-conference that really, really serves them well. Vanderbilt on the road. It's at the Tennessee Titans Stadium. I don't even know how much you can call this like a road game or even like a neutral site. Virginia Tech's going to have a ton of people in Nashville going to this football game. On the road to Vandy. Vandy is going to be, if not the worst team in the SEC, one of the two worst teams in the SEC. Marshall, not the same team without Rasheen Ali. Charles Hubb is actually probably on the hot seat there. At Old Dominion. Look, man, there aren't many games that you look at the schedule and you're like, you cannot lose that game. But Brett Pry, man, if you go to Old Dominion and lose, you cannot do this. You can't. There are a couple things you can't do. That's one of them. You can't go lose to Old Dominion. And then Rutgers coming off of a bye, by the way, going into that game on September 21st. And I want to underscore that because that's going to be a really, really important game, I think, in terms of does Virginia Tech reach their ceiling. Rutgers is going to be good, like you mentioned, David. I think they're going to be good on both sides of the football up front. A lot of people are expecting Rutgers to maybe not be like a top 4 or 5 team in the Big Ten, but like be pretty decent. Like Rutgers is coming into the year with some bowl expectations in a really tough Big Ten. You'll remember last year they won, I think, 5 of their first 6 or something like that, and then just had a brutal schedule down the stretch and like didn't win any of the games that really faced them in October and November. It was kind of a very similar story to Virginia Tech in that Rutgers could not really win the games that were tough on the schedule, and they're going to try to check that box. They got to go to Blacksburg to do it. I obviously think that benefits Virginia Tech. But the swing games on the schedule here, David, for me, in terms of like whether or not Virginia Tech wins like a double-digit amount of games or wins like 8 games, there's 4 of them, in my opinion. The Rutgers game, the Miami game, the Stanford game. This is in terms of like winning 8 to 10. The Stanford game, because you're flying across the country the week after playing Miami, and then at Syracuse the week before Clemson. Of course, beating Clemson would be fantastic. Beating Miami on the road would be fantastic. But the reason why I bring up Miami and not Clemson is because of where Miami falls on the schedule. Coming off of a tough game against Rutgers at home, short week, Friday night, go to Miami, and then you immediately have to fly across the country to go play Stanford for the first time as an ACC member. That's a really, really difficult 3-game stretch just logistically. Not that Virginia Tech's not a better team than Stanford, they are, but logistically, that is just a very, very weird stretch that the Hokies, I think, need to navigate. And then Syracuse on the road in the formerly JMA Wireless Dome, former Carrier Dome, David. They got to go to Syracuse the week before playing Clemson. If that's not a look-ahead spot with first-year Fran Brown and all of the excitement they have around the program, I don't know what is. So those are 4 swing games, in my opinion, where I feel like if Virginia Tech goes like 3-1 in that stretch, they're going to be probably feeling pretty good about winning 10 games.
Yeah, I think one of the others that is going to be very, very, very interesting is Georgia Tech. I think Georgia Tech is no pushover.
No, certainly not. Yep.
Georgia Tech, like Virginia Tech, brings back a near 1,000-yard rushing quarterback and near 1,000-yard rushing running back.
Yep.
It is going to be a very, very ground and pound game for both teams. But I agree. I think the weeks, 4, 5, 6, that is just crucial. Brent Bright talked about it last week, about going out to Stanford, what that trip is going to be like. Hokies are probably going to go out there on Thursday, which is going to be weird, a little bit weird considering they're already going to be early in the week. It'll set up nicely because it'll set up nicely in terms of travel, I think, because they will have, I don't want to say an extra, they will have an extra day of rest, but their extra day of rest will be travel.
Yeah.
After a short week.
Yep.
I think what scares me more is the Rutgers to Miami turnaround than the Miami to Stanford turnaround. I think the Stanford one is only tough because of travel. Mm-hmm. But if travel and everything goes well, I think Tech will be in a fine position. But there are, and then the Syracuse game, man. I think the toughest thing is like the only team in the last 25 years to win at Syracuse had Michael Vick on it for Virginia Tech.
Yeah.
That's the thing. If I expect Syracuse to be pretty good, probably 6-7 wins in Fran Brown's first year.
Yeah, they're bowl mix. Yeah, for sure.
I think the schedule sets up nicely for the Orange. At the same time, that is in some ways, a trap game. Just picture this: Virginia Tech Tech has one loss going into that Syracuse game, and it's at Miami. The Hokies won first 4 games, won the next 3. You're sitting at 7-1 going into Syracuse, and you got Clemson the following week.
Yeah. Yep.
I think that is a game that Syracuse is just giving Tech fits up there. That is a game that you will not be able to overlook. So I think there are a couple I feel good about. Some of the others I feel good about the first 3 that you mentioned, and Duke and Virginia at the end. You're looking at 5. I feel good about Boston College.
Yeah.
So that's 6. If you put Clemson and Miami in that upper echelon of you hope you can win those games, but you're probably, you're not going to be favored. Then that leaves you with, Rutgers, Stanford, Georgia Tech, and Syracuse. And I feel good about the Stanford game, but those are the games that are going to determine, if you take care of your business in the games you should, that are going to determine your record. And again, Rutgers is going to be huge. I would argue that people might not like to hear this, but I would argue that is the biggest home game of the year for Virginia Tech.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's bigger than Clemson.
It's only in terms of, obviously, if Virginia Tech has had a good season leading up to Clemson, that game will be extra
exorbitant,
large.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that Tech is going to win that game.
No.
But Virginia Tech can position itself extremely well by playing well against Rutgers. I think that game will tell us almost everything we need to know about what the next 8 games will look like for Virginia Tech. And because can Tech battle in the trenches? Can Tech stop the run?
Yeah.
I mean, this is a Rutgers team that has a new quarterback, but there were a couple games last year Rutgers won and didn't throw the ball for more than 100 yards.
Yeah.
That's how much Rutgers relies on the run.
Yep.
Can you be physical? Can you battle? That is the first real home game after Marshall. And then 4 of Tech's last 6 games are at home. So if you can give yourself an opportunity to have a good record coming out of those first 6 games. I mean, it'd be great to win Clemson, and I know that's the game everybody has circled on the calendar because it's Clemson, obviously. But the game, like that Rutgers game, to me is going to be huge. And anybody who knows what Tech went through last year and knows kind of where Rutgers stands, I think they kind of understand, and I know you're with me on this, how important that game can be in determining where Virginia Tech stands. Because if Tech starts 4-0, that Miami game on a Friday night becomes massive.
Yep.
But if you go 3-1, it'll still be a big game. But that Rutgers game, I think, can determine a lot of where Virginia Tech is viewed nationally because of the implication it will have in the coming weeks, if that makes sense.
No, I'm with you. I mean, I think there's also a big difference between being 3-2 after the first 5 weeks going to Stanford and being 4-1 or 5-0. There's a gigantic difference. I think the Rutgers game is really important in terms of how Virginia Tech fans will perceive the rest of the season, not necessarily like on a national scale. I think on national scale, fans will be like, oh, Virginia Tech's off to a 4-0 start if Tech beats Rutgers, right? And it's a big game with Miami, so then all of a sudden the national folks will have it circled. But I think it'll be important for Virginia Tech fans to see, okay, if the Hokies are able to hang with a good Rutgers front on both sides of the ball in the trenches, if they can do that, I think what you said about it being a telltale sign for kind of what's to come is really key. I think that's why it's the most important game on the schedule for me in terms of Virginia Tech's opportunity to make a New Year's Six game. I'm not talking making the playoff. You kind of have to see how things shake out. I know that's the popular thing now. For Virginia Tech to win 10 games and you're going to have to kind of show me which 10 and what everybody else is doing in front of them for me to make a decision about whether or not that's good enough. Like if they go 10-3, for example, right? Like let's say they lose in the ACC title game 10-3, they're probably not going to the playoff. But if they're like 11-1 and lose the ACC title game, right? Then maybe they sneak into one of those final spots. But having that kind of crazy conversation about this team requires you beating Rutgers. You got to beat Rutgers. Like it's an important swing game in terms of, are you going to like that level of bowl game? Is it that level of season you're having? Because we can write off the Miami game and the Clemson game. I don't want to say write them off as losses, but they're the two toughest games on the schedule in terms of the actual team that you're facing. I think Rutgers is probably third, and then maybe Georgia Tech. And maybe you can flip-flop those if you want. But Miami and Clemson, I think they are alone in that bucket of those are the two really, really tough games on the schedule where it would not surprise anybody if Virginia Tech went 0-2 in that stretch. And that means you got to win everything else, right? That makes the Rutgers game extra important in terms of bowl selection. And not in terms of making the ACC title game, obviously, because it's not a conference game. But it's really important in terms of maybe where Virginia Tech ends up in the bowl landscape at the end of the year. If you end up in a big-time, like, New Year's Six game, even if you miss the playoff, I mean, I think that's one of those non-playoff New Year's Six games. I do think that's, that's a position for Virginia Tech would like to find themselves in. We'll see. I think it's a 9-3 season. I'll obviously cede the floor to you here in a minute. I'm going to go 9-3. 8-4 wouldn't shock me. 10-2, I think almost everything would have to go right, David. That's kind of where I'm at with it. I just think this is a team, it's really hard to imagine this program with what we've seen so far, and I understand everything that's coming back, and I understand how the schedule sets up. It's really hard for me to go from not seeing them win a game against a good team the first 2 years of Brent Pry's tenure to then all of a sudden expect them to win a bunch of them. And I know there's not a ton of really, really good teams on the schedule, but there are enough 50-50 games where I'm like, man, and we just talked about them. It's like, man, we're now going to sign me up to win all those, all those not named Miami and Clemson, and say it's 10-2. I don't think so. I think the 8-4, 9-3 range sounds about right, and it really just depends on, I think, health in November. Right, you start getting into I know Georgia Tech's last weekend in October, but you get to that Georgia Tech, Syracuse, Clemson stretch of the schedule, and it becomes a matter of like how healthy are you, and maybe that determines if you're 8-4 or 9-3. But I think this is going to be a really good year. I think Virginia Tech has an opportunity to win double-digit games. I just think everything would have to go perfectly right. I think with what they're bringing back and the schedule, dynamic quarterback, good defense. This feels like almost a one-year window, David, to be like this good with this schedule, just considering the veteran leadership on this team and the skill position guys that will be gone after this year. This really feels like a one-year window, so I think Virginia Tech's got to do everything in their power to maximize it.
Yeah, I think should I give my prediction now of what I think the record?
Fire away, man. Fire away. Floor is yours.
I agree with you on all of that. I think this is kind of a make or break. I think this is, like I mentioned earlier, this is an opportunity to kind of reestablish the brand.
Yep.
That's what you said. This is a chance for Virginia Tech to position itself well for the future of the program, of the athletic department, period. There's a lot riding on this. If I had to put a record down, I think I would pick Tech to be 8-4.
Mm-hmm.
I think I still have not seen enough. I think this team has the capability to win 10 games.
Yeah.
But there have been too many times in the past 2 years where things that could go wrong did go wrong, and
Yep.
Virginia Tech did not reach its full capabilities.
Yep.
I'm still not sold on the offensive line. I'm still not sold on the safety play. I think everywhere else things look a lot better. And I think against some of those teams, the Dukes, the Virginias, the Vanderbilts, the Marshalls, the Boston Colleges, Virginia Tech is going to, should have an opportunity to roll those teams. But against the teams that are better, Again, we still have not seen Virginia Tech beat a good team as we enter year 3 of the Brent Pry era. And that's why I think the Rutgers game is so big. That checklist I talked about earlier. Beat a good team at home, on the road. Weeks 4 and 5, back-to-back opportunities to do just that. If you can do that, okay, then it becomes, oh my God, this team is special. This team has a capability to do something really unique. But between injuries, I think there's more depth than Tech has had last couple of years.
Yep.
But I just worry. I still have to see it. I have not seen Tech prove enough. Now, I don't think 9 or 10 wins is out of the question at all. And I'm kind of on the fence between that 8-9 range. There are just too many. I have not seen this program be consistent enough in the games that matter, the big games against good teams, where you'll have Rutgers, Miami, Clemson. You could even throw Georgia Tech in there. And Syracuse is going to be an interesting one too. There are 5 or 6 games on the schedule that Tech is playing a pretty good team.
Yeah.
Maybe not put Syracuse in there, but the other 3, 4.
Yeah, I agree.
What do you do against those teams?
Yeah.
That will just those games will decide your fate.
It's everything.
If you are a team that wins 7 games, or a team that has the potential to win 10 or 11 games. This team has an extremely high ceiling. I think the floor is probably 7 wins minimum.
Yeah.
Which is not something we've said about a Virginia Tech team in a long time.
It's improvement. It's sizable improvement.
For sure. You got to take advantage of the opportunity when you have it, though. If Virginia Tech, I mean, this is kind of like we said, with the portal and with realignment, and who knows if you'll have another opportunity like this again with what you have back. I feel good about 8 wins. If things go right, this can be a 10-win team, or maybe even better. The most interesting thing is how, in my opinion, how will all the continuity over an entire offseason, from staff to players, how will that manifest itself when the season rolls around? Because the schedule is not extremely difficult. It has its ups and downs. But where is this team really? Because the team we saw win 5 of its last 7 and stomp some teams. We know Tech can handle business against teams that are not as good. Virginia, Tulane. Now, obviously, Tulane had all the opt-outs and interim head coach.
Right.
Boston College. We have seen the Hokies handle business against those teams. But, man, if the Hokies come out and beat Rutgers, I think that will be kind of a hold up, like, wait a minute, like, what is, how good is this team actually going to be? And I think and of course Miami's coming up the following week, and some people might lose their minds, but there are a couple tell-all games, and like we talked about, the swing games. There are opportunities to change your season. A lot of it comes down to how good you are in the trenches and stuff.
We'll know early. I mean, that Rutgers game, I think, is the one we're going to circle, see how this team looks against Miami. And then if you're in a scenario where you're 5-0 and are going across the country, that's like the circle it. Don't have the letdown there before the bye week. Don't have the letdown before the bye week.
Yeah, and that's the thing. We haven't seen. When was the last time we saw a Virginia Tech team it's probably been since 2017, really, that we've seen a Virginia Tech team where you're like, oh man, you're in a good spot. Don't do something to blow it.
Don't screw it up.
I mean, it's been a while, and so when we get there, how does that team handle those expectations?
Yeah,
like it is. We are entering a different era. You can see the trajectory. Like Brent Pry and the Hokies are moving forward. There are going to be a couple of road bumps. I'm very curious to see how they handle them.
How do you react to a loss? how do you react to maybe not playing your best game and eking by an opponent on paper that may look inferior? How do you look in the biggest games? How do you look at going to Miami? How do you look at hosting Clemson? Do you handle yourself like adults when Boston College comes to town on Thursday night and you have a much better team than Boston College? Like, do you handle your business when the entire country's watching you? We're going to have those types of questions because Virginia Tech has two kind of standalone games this year, and it's Miami on the road on a Friday night and Boston College at home. And Virginia Tech's going to be a much better team in the Boston College game. Everybody's going to be watching you. Do you handle yourself in a way that you did on their Thursday night game last year, right? Do you come out and just guns a-blazing and you're the better team from the jump? And I just hope that, selfishly as an alum, I just hope that this team just kind of handles their business in the games where they're supposed to. And then if you drop one here or there, that's okay. But I think there's a lot of excitement. I think there's a sense of urgency that needs to be had here just because of what they have and the opportunity that's in front of them with the schedule and everything else. I don't know, and this is the last thing, then we'll get out of here. I don't know that Virginia Tech is going to be quite at the level to make an ACC championship game. You just called out 8-4. I would assume that means that they're probably falling short of Charlotte in your mind. I think at 9-3, I mean, obviously it depends on who they lose to. But I think they're probably just like half a step behind on paper at least. And everybody's going to laugh at the Miami thing, but like Miami's got a good team with a good quarterback. And, as long as Mario takes a knee, like in a game where he has a lead late, like they should be all right. Clemson is going to have a good team. Everybody likes to clown Dabo about the transfer portal. I think it's warranted for sure, but they have a very good team. Like they're better than most of the ACC. Florida State, I know they lost a lot, but they are returning a good team. Like I feel like those programs that have a little bit more depth behind them, I feel like they could give Virginia Tech some trouble in terms of like the Hokies chase to get to Charlotte. So I'm not sure if Virginia Tech's on that level or not, but I think they're certainly capable of getting there, is what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, when I submitted my, last couple of days over the weekend, I believe, when I submitted my ACC predicted order of finish, which I believe will drop sometime this afternoon, I had the Hokies 6th. I think that is a good spot. I had them. I'm going to pull it up just to double check. I had them behind a team like Miami. Let's see, ACC preseason. Nope. I'm trying to remember who I had the Hokies in front of or behind. I had. No, I'm not gonna be able to find it. I'll just try to remember it off the top of my head. I'm trying to think. I think I had Florida State, Clemson, Miami, Louisville, and NC State all ahead of Tech in some order.
Reasonable.
Yeah, I think those are teams that have proven they can win big games against good teams. That's kind of what it comes down to. And I think there are a couple teams behind Virginia Tech that are in a similar boat. And I think a lot of people will pick Tech in that similar range, which means a lot of people expect Tech to be pretty good. But I think Virginia Tech winning 5 or 6 conference games is what I would expect.
Right.
I think 7 would be fantastic. That means you're going 7-1.
That means you're going to Charlotte. That means you're going to Charlotte.
Yeah. I think winning 5 or 6 puts you in the conversation, and I think that should be Virginia Tech's goal, to be in that conversation.
Yeah.
And then see where things lead from there. It's a team with a lot of potential. Just kind of got to go win games.
Yeah, you can't skip steps in a rebuild. I think fans think just because the portal exists, you can just like automatically skip steps. And you realize pretty quickly it's still hard to do that because you need depth. And depth is really what separates like the top 5 or 6 teams in the country from everybody else. And, I just think that that's kind of the next step Virginia Tech needs to get to, and I think they're well on their way to doing that. I just don't know that they're all the way there yet. So, but still, I mean, 8 or 9 win season compared to what we've been watching, and that's just the regular season. I mean, geez, a lot of fans should be signed up for that at the minimum, right? So, feeling good about the 2024 season, David. We'll see what happens. Appreciate having you on, David. Just want to give you an opportunity, of course, to plug where you're at, all your stuff.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I know the funny thing is, a week or two we'll probably go on a nice round table with a bunch of people who will clown us as always or shame us as always for being more optimistic or less optimistic than they are.
Right.
We're more realist.
Right.
I would say.
I would call it realist. Yeah, I'd call it realist.
Yeah. Yeah. Mike, thanks for having me on as always. This is awesome, and I always appreciate you having me on. You can find my work at techsideline.com. Football camp starts this Friday, or starts today. We'll have our first media access this Friday. So we'll have, me and our team will have a ton of stuff coming from Virginia Tech football fall camp. If you want to follow along with the ins and outs of Virginia Tech football season, you can go to techsideline.com. We have a podcast. We have which you can find on YouTube. Just search Tech Sideline Podcast or TSL Podcast.
Big fan.
And you can follow. And I appreciate it. And you can follow us on social media too. I am at the Real D Cunna on Twitter. I'm excited, man. It's funny. I started as a student in 2017, and I got to experience my first game on campus was the West Virginia game. When Virginia Tech beat West Virginia at FedEx, I was on campus watching that game.
Yep.
That was a pretty good team, a 9-win team. It's been a while since I've lived in Blacksburg since that I've gotten to cover a good team. So I'm excited just for the engagement and to cover a team with expectations. People expect them to do something. Can they live up to them? And I'm very interested because it'll be a nice change of pace from covering teams that have won 6 games, 7 games, 3 games over the last couple of years. So yeah. It'll be good. I appreciate everybody who follows along, and can't wait until we do this again, Mike, after the season. Hopefully we're talking about a pretty good year.
Yeah, I mean, I think we had you on in the winter, and we were definitely more optimistic with the way things went, and I'm hoping that continues to be the case, kind of regardless of where Virginia Tech ultimately lands on a win-loss. If you're not a Virginia Tech fan, and you just want some intel on other teams in the conference, David is the follow in the Virginia Tech Twitter sphere. He's the guy you need to follow. If I pick one account, he's it. I've told him that off the air before. I've said it on the air here several times. I mean it. Virginia Tech fan, if you're a Virginia Tech fan not following David, I want to know what you do. I don't know if those people even exist at this point, but they may. So make sure to follow David at the Real D Cunna on Twitter. Go check out Tech Sideline. I'm a subscriber. There's no reason not to be. So go check that out. David, appreciate it, man. We'll have you back on soon.
Yeah, appreciate it, man. Thanks.
And then we'll get out of here. There are more season previews to come. Follow our handle on Twitter at BC Podcast ACC. Longest email address known to man, basketballconferencepodcast@gmail.com, youtube.com/@the ACC Football Podcast. Go check that out as well. Until next time, go ACC.